evening, everybody. My name is Alexandra Saylor. I'm here as a graduate student from the not K-6 program, but teaching focus in professional studies. And I'm getting my master's in ed, so it doesn't matter. I'm still passing, right? I will reference that in this presentation today. Student socioeconomic status and high-stakes test anxiety levels in grades 3 through 5 is what I proposed to do research on. I was able to get several interviews with 4 Arlington school principals, several teachers in these grades, but I don't have raw, actual quantitative data today. It's more of a case study today. But I do have supporting data. The word test, something that scared me a lot as a child and still does. How many of you have ever taken a test? Raise your hand. How many have failed a test or walked away feeling less than satisfied after a test? I failed my driver's test, I think, 3 times before I passed. I did not pass the praxis one, but I'm still getting my master's degree and my license. What are your feelings before a test? Nervous? Normal? I know I'm very scared to take tests, and I've passed on to my students to not worry about tests so much. I teach kindergarten right now, and the more tests we do, the more comfortable they become. I've used such coping strategies as GoNoodle.com, which relaxes the brain before you take a test. They get to imagine a balloon floating up into the air before you take a test and get rid of all their sticky thoughts. I have noticed as my observations throughout my degree in Marymount that a lot of teachers aren't really actively engaging the students that have anxiety towards tests. I taught as a long-term sub at Nottingham Elementary, and I had about 4 students in my 4th grade class who just would totally lose it for a math test. And the teacher that I took over for hadn't really done anything to implement handling that, so I did, and I found that it worked really well. I let them chew gum with permission from the principal and parent. I let them spin around in my special pink chair, and if they needed a stress ball, I gave them one. So we have to adapt for our students. Please take a few minutes. You don't have to actually fill it out, but just look at the questionnaire that I did give to those 4 schools. In an ideal sample, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, I would have obviously had a larger sample pool, perhaps of 10 schools in Arlington, covering both high income areas as well as low. Although, let's be honest, it's Arlington. Test anxiety defined. Test anxiety consists of thoughts, feelings, and physiological reactions students experience when they're very concerned about poor performance in testing situations. Students may slow down or even give up entirely. When I was a child, my parents can attest to this. 1st grade, I was diagnosed with test anxiety, particularly in math. I gave up and would just cry and throw down my pencil and say, I can't do it. So that's what that's for. Test anxiety is not selective like any type of disorder. It affects students of all genders, race, nationalities, and socioeconomic statuses, ages, and backgrounds. I define socioeconomic status. I know that many of us in here know what that is, but for those of you who don't, it's the demographic measurement of an individual or group of people's, family, or exact location, sociological and economic status, and how these factors influence their income, education, occupation, and overall social placement in the larger community. My hypothesis when I was putting together this proposal was that there will be a negative correlation based on the existing research between SES and higher levels of test anxiety on standardized tests. The questions that will guide the study are the following. How does SES impact high-stakes test anxiety levels in students in grades 3 through 5? And how do student test anxiety levels vary when comparing males to females? I found in my research that most of it was based on gender and age. Very limited research has been done since the enactment of No Child Left Behind, which we all love so much. In 2001, there's been about 4 studies specifically done on these grades in regards to high-stakes testing and anxiety. At least as of this spring. The purpose I wanted to do this for was for myself. We were asked to choose a topic that we were passionate about. And I'm not saying we shouldn't have tests, because we actually need to have them. But for the students that have anxiety, we need to do more for them. To examine the impact of SES that it has on standardized test anxiety, I'm going to focus tonight on the 2 schools that I thought I got the most data from. And that was a school in North Arlington, where I live, and a school in South Arlington, which is a Title I school. I found that through the survey and talking with the principal and the teachers in grades 3 through 5 at both schools, that not only were students anxious about SOLs, but obviously teachers themselves were worried about keeping their jobs, and were fearing that creativity that they pumped into all their lessons was getting cut due to the race of the clock to get to the test. Further, the purpose of this mixed method study is to explore the relationship between high stakes testing on student test anxiety levels. I will specifically attempt to examine a lesser research variable, which is SES, and the impact it has on the overall student performance, and also coping methods, as I said. Delimitations and possible bias to my study. Results may present the finding true for all people in all times and places, with lots of variables to consider when you're doing a study like this. Use of self-administered questionnaires, which you see, which clearly will present certain bias depending on how kids read them, and asking a child what their income is kind of silly because they're 8 to 11. I know I didn't know how much my parents made.
A lot.
20,000? Sure. Results from questionnaire interviews may be skewed for those who suffer from test anxiety. Even taking the questionnaire could present, obviously, bias. So, and also I know as a teacher myself, I'm sure Robin can attest, when you're in a class and a student at Marymount asks you to take a survey with their class, that's like the last thing you want to do because you have to do your job. My sample, like I said, would ideally be 50. My intention was to have 50 students in grades 3 through 5 from each of 10 randomly selected Arlington County schools, totaling 1,500, including the teachers. We have a very diverse population of students here, as well as income, which I didn't really know because I'm a product of northern Arlington. So I worked in several South Arlington schools over the summers the last couple of years, and I found a huge array of cultural, language, and economic diversity. And that definitely impacts the students' performance on tests, which they may have no context for at all. This was more of a qualitative study, as I said, and I gathered very helpful anecdotal data from teachers in grades 3 through 5 at the 4 locations, and the levels of test anxiety and the phases throughout the test, from the beginning, during, and after. And you'll see that on the survey that I asked students how they feel before. I even asked the teachers, how do your class feel? Do you ask them in the morning, how do you feel about the test? Thumbs up, so-so, or not? We talk a lot about how they get their students ready, not just memorizing the content, but how they engage them to really understand what they're being tested on. And sometimes I feel that in SOLs, we don't have time to do that. We just need to get it in. The framework of interview questions could present possible bias, as I said, and it is difficult to ask students about their income. I found one very helpful study that was done by a professor named John Siegel, and he used a CTAS scale, which he was able to get more quantitative data with. And what he did was he had a sample of 261 students in a Cincinnati area school, and he went to the rich suburbs, the middle suburbs, or middle income people, and the low. And he found that overall, there wasn't that much of a correlation between SES in elementary, but there was in middle school. So of course that doesn't help my proposal. But he did a really good analysis of talking about, in his qualitative research, through interviewing the parents, he found out that parents in lower socioeconomic places are obviously working 2, sometimes 3 jobs to keep up with the cost of living. And if you're in an area where the public schools are really poor and do not have resources, maybe you're paying private education, you're going to be working even harder to make your kids be able to go to that school. Obviously, if your mom and dad are home to help you study, if you're a single parent and you're holding the fort down, it's going to be really hard for your child to get that home reciprocity and support for the test. Possible limitations, I had a lot. A lot of principals who just didn't have time, didn't want to meet with me, and I feel like I should have included, I would include if I did this for real, private schools also in this study to get a more broad perspective. Most case students in grades 3 through 5 indicate in the studies I've found higher levels of test anxiety due to their age rather than their SES. You start doing standardized tests in 3rd grade, and they've recently done away, I think 2 years ago, with the social studies test because it's very difficult to test a 3rd grader on civics and government when they don't really have any basis of knowledge coming from 2nd grade in. So they found that the numbers were very skewed and it was probably not worth taking that test at that grade level. There's a visible increase in students aged 8 to 11 exhibiting more test anxiety, particularly in the primary subjects, math, science, social studies, and reading. But I focused mainly on math and reading because those are the big ones. SES did not elicit a strong measurable correlation between high anxiety levels in students, grades 3 through 5, and it is not a direct correlation to race. Current research on test anxiety, there isn't a whole lot, but I did a lot of research through the American Psychological Association, and I found this very interesting piece from New York State, which is a Common Core state. We are not. For those of you who don't know what Common Core is, it's a very standardized curriculum, and that's something that Virginia does not support. According to New York State school and state psychologists, nearly 700 school districts in New York said state tests are causing greater anxiety than assessments themselves. So the average student takes about 12 tests a year, and that's not including SOLs. From quarterly benchmarks to mid-quarter benchmarks to mid-year benchmarks, and then you're not even thinking about the chapter and unit tests in between all that. We don't really have a lot of research on test anxiety in these grades. I'm not sure why. It's been a while since 2001. I think it's worth analyzing. If we're getting all this data from testing our students throughout the year and from SOLs, why aren't we doing research to find out how it's affecting their overall well-being and performance in other areas in school? The reason for concern, this is a great quote from the American Evaluation Association: high-stakes testing leads to underserving or misserving all students, especially the most needy and vulnerable, thereby violating the principle of do no harm. Essentially, this is kind of mocking 2001's act. If states persist in making a student's fate rest on a single test, that is to be going to the next grade or to graduate, the likely result over the next few years would be nothing short of catastrophic, resembling what might, without exaggeration, be described as an educational ethnic cleansing. Very strong. My argument is simply this: it is not just cognitive. More variables need to be considered when making these tests, such as SES, parental income, affects basic needs of students to succeed, time to prepare with the parent, how teachers are preparing the children, and how they are getting informed about these tests. Nationality and background. If I am coming in as an ELL student to a third grade classroom from Guatemala, I am not going to know who Thomas Jefferson is, period. So why am I being tested on it? Context is not there on standardized tests, so how is this an accurate assessment? My argument continued. I think that there needs to be more funding allocated to programs set up in schools, both state, federal, state, and countywide, on those levels to support students with test anxiety. When I worked at Nottingham, I actually did the SOL prep for both math and reading for 4th and 5th graders, which I thought they were joking when they asked me to do that. And I thought to myself, wow, okay, here's a box of materials, and I have to teach these kids beginnings of algebra. Sure, I can do it. Got up every morning at 7 a.m., went in there for an hour before school, and all of those children were so stressed about this test. They were identifying themselves already as being failures, already not going to succeed on it, and it never was explained to me that my job would also be to talk them off of that. I think teachers feel forced to teach to a test. I've seen it a lot myself. And again, I mentioned this earlier, our creativity is being kind of sucked out of us. Our other counterparts in industrializations like Finland, Korea, Japan, and all over Europe, Germany, Italy, they are not doing these tests, and their scores are off the charts, and people are finding a lot more success. This is a ranking done in 2015, January, of according to Pearson, the United States has a cognitive skills and educational attainment of 0.39, which makes us grade 14 on a minute. You can see South Korea's top. Poverty rate by country. I thought this was really interesting that the United States has the highest of those countries, which I think directly does affect students' performance. If they haven't eaten in the mornings, they have no breakfast. I know I ask my kindergartners every day, did you eat breakfast today? And if they don't have a snack, I usually feed at least 6 kids a week a snack. And that's in a very high income area. Education is economics. I won't go through all this with you, but essentially these charts are saying that we are, average reading scores, for example, the red graph for 4th grade students by percentage of students in public eligibility for reduced price lunch, their income is directly affecting their education. Their reading levels are low. Math, we actually oddly performed higher than Finland on this, but if you really analyze the data and the study, that was skewed as well because it didn't reflect all the students in that school. It only was a sample. I think student success is at risk, and I think we need to be student-based, and the legislators have gotten away from that. Education is about the students. It's not about how good our scores are as a country. Loss of core subjects like social studies is happening all over the country, and even science. Loss of secondary subjects like music, art, and theater, which were my only outlets as a kid. The average student in grade 3 through 5, as I said, takes 12 tests a year. That's not including the SOLs. And in addition to that, when you're in the primary grades and throughout your elementary experience, you usually have to take a reading and math assessment like the DRA or PALS if you're K through 2. And I'm using now DRA in my classroom, and a lot of my children are just nervous to come out in the hall with me. Dangerous implications, I did find some really interesting journals, again in the APA research that I did, really high increase in suicide rates, even among elementary students, which I was shocked. It's not just collegiate level. Rise in anxiety levels, as I talked about, eating disorders, even for 5th and 6th graders. Psychological damage, giving up mentality and demotivating, and drug addiction. I've seen so many times kids in my class and ones that I've subbed in be totally demotivated in the subject, so much so that they just give up entirely and they assume they're going to fail, so they just guess on a test. I did that too. The need for further research. The literature I've found is almost non-existent on the relationship between test anxiety levels on the standardized SOL exams. There isn't really anything since this act, the No Child Left Behind. Even though scholars have noted the importance of the classroom culture, environment, and how this affects the overall ecology of the students' well-being, there isn't research on it. This focus study needs to be explored using qualitative methodology, I think even more than quantitative, because it is so individually based, I feel. And I would love to expand this beyond Arlington if I did it for real. And who is the focus? And that's students. What's in their best interest? How can we support them and their educational experience? And this is a little video. I'm only going to play a minute and 49 seconds.
That's me, over 20 years ago, when I was 10 years old. I had a 4th grade teacher I admired more than I could even comprehend. I wrote mountains of silly books that sat in my closet, until it was time to start preparing for it. The test. The standardized test, the thing that would define us. Nothing mattered but this test. We were told how important it was. We were offered rewards for doing well, and prepared for it like it was some sort of triathlon. And so, bubble after bubble, question after question, passage after passage, I poured myself into that test, barely understanding what I was reading or why. And when the scores came back, I saw the disappointment on my teacher's face, the sadness in my parents' eyes. 40%. I was a 40. While my friends were 80s or 90s or 95s, I was a 40. So I wrote about that test. Angry, upset, frustrating things we couldn't say in school because we had to stay positive. I started practicing my reading comprehension. I turned the page on my reading problems and started reading fun books, asking for extra help from my teachers. But I never forgot the fact that I was a 40, because I had let that test, that giant monster of questions and bubbles and passages and facts, define me.
And I won't continue, but the gentleman that did this video
23 years later,
talked about how 23 years later he actually became a professor baccalaureate, went on to teach for over 12 years, and has since then had some of the highest standardized testing scores in his Philadelphia classroom. And that's because he doesn't teach the test. That's it. Are there any questions? Oh, I remember.
I have a question.
Yes. dad.
And being your father, it's my appointed duty to somehow embarrass you. But I'm not going to, okay? What is a Title I school? What does that mean?
Title I school is a school with typically lower income household families, and they don't get as much funding in that school based on the tax brackets. So for example, Patrick Henry would fall under that, Hoffman Mifflin.
Okay.
Any questions? Yeah, great.
You mentioned briefly teacher anxiety
Uh-huh.
around tests.
Yes.
So I was wondering about, because my initial assumption would have been similar to yours, that
Uh-huh.
students in higher SES situations would have more test anxiety, more
Yes.
pressure in general. But I'm wondering, because I know so much funding is tied to test scores, and that's particularly an issue in Title I schools like that. And so I was thinking that would ratchet up the teacher anxiety, which would in turn make the students anxious as well. So
It did.
there are so many little pieces to pull apart to try to figure out what's causing what, but I was curious about any research you might have seen about.
Yeah,
teacher
from
anxiety.
the interviews I did at Hoffman Mifflin and Patrick Henry, I did speak to several teachers in grades 3 through 5, and they did tell me they themselves experienced as much test anxiety as their students. And there was one awesome teacher at Patrick Henry who actually developed this game they would play at the end of the year for like 2 weeks before the test. While they were prepping for it, they would just have this brain break moment and play this silly game and just say, make up words for the test. Instead of calling it test, they'd call it testy and make cutesy names to kind of get themselves scaled down and not worry about it. And they would actually talk about not defining themselves by a number, which is why I love that video, because I did the same thing. And I still look at my Praxis 1 scores or the ETS score report and kick myself, but you just can't be defined by a number. Yeah. Anybody else?